The information contained in this video is strictly for informational purposes only and does not constitute financial, legal, or other professional advice and is not a substitute for consultation with a qualified professional. The opinions expressed in the show do not necessarily reflect the views of the Center for Continuing Education and Workforce Development, the Borough of Manhattan Community College, and the City University of New York. State of Mind is a web-based discussion program that explores the relevant social, economic, and political issues that are prominent at the post-secondary level of education. State of Mind is sponsored by the Center for Continuing Education and Workforce Development at the Borough of Manhattan Community College. BMCC. Start here, go anywhere. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Krishna Nadella, and this is State of Mind. Today we're kicking off a three-part series entitled, Let's Talk About Sex. Today's topic is about sexual freedom, experimentation, and beliefs. With us here today to help better understand our topic and provide their very unique perspectives are the following guests. To my immediate left is Dr. Michael McGee, an assistant professor in the Health Education Department at the Borough of Manhattan Community College and an adjunct professor at the Center for Human Sexuality Studies at Widener University. Previously, Dr. McGee was the Vice President for Education at Planned Parenthood Federation of America and also served as the Executive Director of the World Association for Sexual Health. He received a Master's of Education and a PhD from Widener University and a Bachelor's from SUNY Empire State. Thank you, Dr. McGee. To Dr. McGee's left is Jennifer Baumgardner, the Executive Director and Publisher at the Feminist Press at CUNY. Ms. Baumgardner is a writer, activist, filmmaker, and lecturer whose work explores abortion, sex, bisexuality, rape, single parenthood, and women's power. She attended Lawrence University, where she helped organize Guerrilla Theater, a feminist group on campus, and started an alternative newspaper called The Other that focused on issues of women's liberation. Thank you, Jennifer.
Thank you.
So, Michael, I'd like to start off with you. College is a unique time in an individual's life. In addition to the aspects of moving away from home, making one's own decisions, and managing their time and money, there is a development of individuality and identity. With college being an open environment for experiences and emotions, has it always been the most appropriate arena for this development? And if so, why?
I don't know about whether it's the most appropriate venue, but it is something that happens as adolescents separate from their parents and individuate. Going into a university or college setting, they are free to explore. A lot of kids reinvent themselves, sort of leave the baggage of who they were in high school behind. And they are, at least on this campus and on many other campuses, they're in an environment with a really diverse population. And so they're exposed to a much broader worldview than what they had at home very often. And so it's a time to explore and try new things out, try being different kinds of people, if you will.
Jennifer, your thoughts on that?
Well, I just even thinking to when I was in college, it's also, it's a time where it's a little bit safe too. So it's not quite the real world. I mean, depending on the kind of college you go to, I guess, and what your life is like. But if you're living on a campus, it's not quite the real world yet. Someone else is like buying the toilet paper and putting it in the bathroom, which is maybe like it was when you were at home, but you're not with your parents. And you're at if you're, between the ages of 18 and 22 as the traditional times to go to college, you're also sort of at the height of, in a way, of your emerging sexuality. So you're post-pubescent, but you haven't totally figured it out yet. And I think what's so interesting about college is it's a wonderful time. I had a great college experience, but it's also the place where many people do experience sexual assault. The most likely time to experience a sexual assault as a girl is fall term freshman year, and it has to do with there not being maybe an adequate support system for that transition that's based in reality. Right. Like certainly they're all giving rape whistles and things like that, but that's not really what I mean, I guess, about having adequate transition. It would start way before then with parents, with high schools, with junior highs, really addressing all of the submerged misogyny and sexual violence that's already happened to students before they arrive there, or what they've already experienced, or what's being passed down from generations, because we've never had a time in, millennia where there isn't overt sexual violence happening all the time. So of course we reproduce it, and I think there's this expectation that college is where it starts, but it's actually just a reproduction, but there's less there's less parents, I guess, to get involved, and so there's more, and there's access to alcohol, and alcohol is a major factor in all forms of positive experimentation, but negative expressions.
So I want to continue on that train of thought. If the college environment has traditionally been one where an individual can express their individuality and identity, but more importantly, sexual orientation, what is it about the academic arena that allows it to at times act as a safe haven for young individuals to learn about themselves and express their respective identities, especially in light of what they were back home before they went to college?
Yeah, I think, certainly BMCC and most colleges have a variety of institutional supports for sexual minorities. There are safe zone programs. We have one here where the faculty and staff are trained in how to be supportive ally for LGBTQ youth. There's a peer club of LGBT success. There are observances. November is LGBTQA Awareness Month. There's
October 11th is National Coming Out Day. There's
go.
all these holidays
right.
you can do
all
programming
of these
around.
things that are kind of institutionally supportive. And then there's the didactic stuff. I teach a human sexuality course, but there are gender studies courses and psychology and sociology. All of those kinds of courses in the curriculum can support young people exploring their sexuality and their sexual identity.
I think it's also an opportunity. Well, first of all, it has changed so much in the last 25 years around that. I think that people had same-sex affairs in college, and it was a space to, mainly because you had access to overnight, time with one another. But I think in terms of being supported and it being something that the administration does programming around and does sensitivity training, and that students, younger people are certainly leading the way with this. That's new. That's in the last couple decades. But just getting to the idea of why college, I think it's because there's this moment where school, K through 12 was really a site of socialization, really like full-on socialization. We could even do a better job of what we're doing, but it's definitely like you're learning how to be normal.
Right.
College, you're getting this opportunity to figure out how amazing your mind is and like what are you good at, and what, if your dad wasn't telling you what to be, what would you do? There's that little bit of getting to be seen as an individual, whereas I really felt, and I feel like I still observe this, you're just really trying to be normal and fit in up until a certain part. In college, you're really trying to be different.
Yeah.
And it's honored when you're different. Although, going to a school like BMCC versus where I went to school at Lawrence University in a small town in Wisconsin, I just still think it's night and day, probably in terms of people's sense of diversity, for instance, but even sexuality diversity. I can't think of anyone who was out when I was in college at Lawrence.
Fair enough. So let's take that train of thought one more step. So on the flip side of what we're talking about, a safe haven, what type of dichotomy is potentially created when a student is the first in their family to attend college? That is there a concern that although the child may flourish and evolve as an individual, this could also lead to a separation from their parents should they differ in regards to sexuality and how it's perceived?
Well, that certainly happens. I think
And not just around sexuality, it's
a
huge
whole boatload of
beliefs.
things.
Yeah,
Sure,
yeah.
absolutely.
Oh, and class leads. There's so many things when you're the first,
Exactly. And particularly, like we have a lot of international students here, so people who are coming from a more traditional culture where everything is very clearly delineated and the parameters of who you're supposed to be and how you're supposed to be are very clear, and then you come to the university setting and it opens up all kinds of possibilities, and people begin to explore that, and it can be really troubling to parents, and the degree to which their children become acculturated into American culture and society can be troubling for a lot of parents to deal with. Often they're very proud and eager for their children to have this experience of higher education, and they have that investment and support, but then they see their kid kind of going a different way than what they were expecting, and that can be really disturbing for some folks.
And I think that some people, when you just think of New York City and a place like CUNY and all of the 500,000 students that are educated here every year, I've heard that's the number, people come to New York for a really specific reason, and it's often to get away, honestly. And so I don't know, I wonder if there's something very specific that happens in the transition of coming to New York City. I think being the first child to go to college, or the first person to go to college in your family, and again, to go to somewhere in the rural Midwest, might bring different tensions. And I think the thing that we want to avoid or find ways to support students with is the experience of having to negate some piece of themselves. So they need to remain in relationship with their family of origin, with their culture of origin, and at the same time not create some sort of space where just like replicating bigotry or things like that is excused because that was in some way a part of their cultural origin. Like being able to respect and maintain the connection. I guess what's popping into my head right now is clitoridectomy or things like that.
Right.
Being able to be critical of that as an incredibly abusive, misogynist practice, and at the same time not really in a simplistic way scapegoat a whole culture.
Right. I mean, if you think about it from the standpoint, we talked about a cultural change. If you come from one that is more conservative, to be politically correct, but one that maybe doesn't have the same equation between men and women amongst the genders, is the process of being educated not just what you learn in the classroom, but what you learn in life. And if that is the case, and if that is what the parents truly want, isn't it somewhat hypocritical for them to then say, this is not acceptable, this is not what I had in store for you by sending you to post-secondary education?
Yeah, if you want your kids to remain similar to you, do not educate them.
Fair enough.
If you want to keep them conservative, don't educate them.
Fair enough. All right, so turning to you, Jennifer, regardless of sexual orientation, college students traditionally range, as you said, between 18 and 22. This is a time in their lives when hormones, amongst every other thing, is raging, and their desire to connect with another individual typically develops. Depending on one's background and upbringing, students become more mature when it comes to their experiences and their maturities when it comes to sex. Now, with that said, how does that play into the social experience, and what are the concerns for an individual who's lacking in sexual experience entering college?
Well, I don't see a lot of maturity in sexual experience expressed among college students. And I don't blame them. I think, like, how would they have learned it? But I think there's this whole period of learning about sex. I don't know if there's a better way to do it that's about fumbling. And we haven't provided safe spaces for people to fumble without major implications.
Absolutely.
And I don't just mean disease. I mean, like, being slut-shamed, being raped, having all sorts of things happen that they didn't want to have happen. And I think that the awkwardness around, I agree, there's this intense desire to connect, like really intense, overwhelming. And then this intense embarrassment or awkwardness or not really knowing what to do, and no cultural space to be awkward or fumble or not know what you're doing. And I really think that's turned up now with the internet and social media and things like that. You really have to act like you really know what's going on and maybe put on a facade. And I think that that's where alcohol plays a really negative role. I mean, I drink. I sound like I'm such a teetotaler right now. But I think it plays an incredibly negative role in covering for that awkwardness, but then rendering everybody very, very vulnerable. And I think people that might be assailants or perpetuators, and then certainly people who might be victimized.
So, Michael, just to take that point, and as someone myself who maybe had a misconception, the image of knowing your sexuality, the image of owning your sexuality. As a professor, you see students on campus all the time. With this supercharged world we live in, with the internet so readily available, what is the current state of students coming into the college environment?
I agree with everything Jennifer just said. There's a lot of fumbling and then covering it, pretending that I know or I should know, or but kids don't really. But unfortunately, the default educator of most kids nowadays is internet porn, which is so sad because it's ridiculous fantasy stuff. And the anonymous questions I get are, it's clear that, so is semen good for my skin? Why would you think that? It's because they saw somebody come on some woman's face,
Well, the average age that a child sees his or her first internet porn now is age 8.
Yeah.
And I don't mean something tame. I mean something, probably things I've never seen, something that'll blow your mind.
Yeah. But the average age of first intercourse is 17.
Right.
So, I mean, that means average, so some are younger, some are later. But by the time they come here, like 2/3 of high school seniors have had sex at least once, partnered sex at least once. So most students have some sexual experience before whether they wanted it or not.
Right.
But as Jennifer said, there's an awful lot of drunk sex that goes on, and a lot of fumbling, and a lot of
unconscious coupling as opposed to conscious uncoupling, courtesy of Gwyneth.
Yeah, exactly. And folks don't really know what they're doing. I'm amazed when I ask students, have you in your home growing up, did you ever hear the word clitoris? And everybody goes, no.
Because it's embarrassing, or but they know what it is.
My parents would never say it. some of them don't know what it is. And this is sort of an integral part of a woman's pleasure and sexual experience. And, they've seen lots of porn, but they have no clue about,
What feel good.
what feels good.
Yeah.
So this is a very, very good point that I want to hit upon, because in general, humans are social creatures. We can all agree upon that. How important is it, in your opinion, that some level of sexual experimentation occurred during one's college experience? That is the idea of the 40-year-old virgin detrimental, and that the longer one puts off discovering their sexuality, the more overwhelming the sexual experience becomes over time?
I don't know about that piece of it, but I do think that there's a certain amount of tension or anxiety before having intercourse for the first time, if that's your bag, or any sort of kind of more advanced sexual act. But even a kiss, actually, I can think of my first kiss and I was like freaking out. And so, I could see, I do think that anxiety exists before you do it, regardless maybe of age. But if you're older, maybe you feel a little more like shame or self-conscious about, again, not knowing what you're doing. But in most cases, putting off sexual behavior or delaying it is very positive for the individual. So I think that sex is a part of being alive for most of us. It's a life force, and it's a beautiful thing, but there is definitely no shame in delaying sexual relationships. And I think a lot of early sexual experience is unwanted.
And I would like to follow up on that. I agree. I absolutely support young people who want to delay intercourse until their wedding night, or they get their PhD, or whatever it is that they have in mind. And that's a good thing. We need to give young people the information and skills to be able to negotiate that. I think when you're talking about the 40-year-old virgin kind of thing, that's often problematic. I work with an organization of sex therapists and educators and counselors, and that is an issue when people tend not to have any sexual experience with themselves or another person because they feel shame or guilt about sexuality in general or their body, and they don't know what feels good and all the rest of it. It can be a real issue when they finally do want to become sexual or become sexual with another person, because they have some inner turmoil about, whether or not it's appropriate. A lot of moralism tends to go with, and guilt and all of that stuff can be a hurdle to get over.
So let's take can I jump in?
Please.
Because I'm curious about, because I feel like we haven't really addressed this, but it's something that's come up certainly when I'm working with young people, is this sort of, it seems kind of a mini movement, but a real one, of practicing asexuals. So somebody who says, I do have a sexuality, but my sexuality is asexual. I don't masturbate. I don't express sexuality in any of the ways you would, you would assume, or, that we think is like this vitality or this life force. Have you had a lot of experience with students or young people who say that they practice asexuality and that's their form of sexuality? And then how do you interpret that?
It's not, I have not seen a lot of students, a few, who identify as asexual. My understanding of it right now, and I learn new stuff all the time, but right now my understanding of asexuality is that it's an orientation.
Right.
So people are maybe highly attracted to the other sex, or highly attracted to their own sex, or equally to both sexes, and asexual folks aren't attracted sexually in a lustful sort of way to either. They want friendships, they want relationships, but the sexual component isn't a part of their kind of inner life.
But there would have been a time when that would have been construed as pathological.
Absolutely.
And now I'm saying there's a movement to say it's not. It's actually, this is my
Form of
sexuality.
acceptance, So let's take a real life example, an unfortunate one, but one that I think serves well for this conversation. 4 years ago, Tyler Clemente, a freshman at Rutgers University, committed suicide after being taunted and bullied online by his roommates for his sexual orientation and preference. The key is that he only came out a few weeks prior to attending Rutgers to his parents. What people don't realize at home is that the same month Clemente died, 4 other American teenagers were reported to have committed suicide after being taunted about their homosexuality. Michael, Jennifer, we've established that college is a melting pot of experiences and emotions. With that said, that melting pot provides 180 degrees of experiences, backgrounds, and beliefs. If we would have to go to the source, we haven't touched upon this really in depth yet, but where does the role of parents and their views play into the overall picture? are they not somewhat responsible for educating their children on their sexual orientation and expression?
Yes, the short answer. And the line that I used earlier is one that I repeat often, and that is parents are the primary sexuality educators of their kids, whether they do it on purpose or not. From the time a baby is born, the way you hold it and talk to it, you're conveying what being loved feels like, and how, the music of communication when somebody cares for you. So, from the get-go, parents are giving kids messages about all of that. And certainly around sexual orientation and sexual behaviors and what's appropriate and what's not, and whatever values the parents believe in are all part of what they communicate to their kids. So kids generally have a pretty good idea of what their parents think about those things. Often parents have a real hard time having the talk, as if it was one talk. It should likely, ideally be a lifelong conversation. But, parents often feel like they don't know how to bring it up or how to talk about it. And the advice I always give is to use popular culture, because there's always something on television or in the news or whatever about a sexual issue that you can talk about. And certainly in these days, news stories about which states now allow same-sex marriage, and all of the television characters who are gay or lesbian, and all of that is an opportunity to say, this is what I think about that. What do you think about that? And have that conversation. So absolutely, parents have a responsibility to be the educator around orientation and everything else.
So if someone comes in with a certain belief that was predisposed to them from their parents, one that maybe is a little bit more conservative, a little less open-minded, how much of a difficulty is it for them to open their train of thought? Typically, with almost 2 decades of pre-existing, conditioning, to change that and be able to say, you know what, mom and dad were wrong, if that's what they choose to believe. It sounds like there's a tremendous barrier to entry to see any other form of perspective outside of what they were raised with.
I think that's true. I certainly see it in my students. My human sexuality students do a lot of writing that I am the only person who sees it, so they disclose a lot of stuff. And it's clear that no matter how much I talk about abortion, for instance, and all of the different sides of that, and they do pro-con papers about it, they don't tend to shift their opinion on that. It's exactly what they came in with.
That's so different than anything about sexuality, I must say, because we all know so many people who are gay or we are gay or whatever. There's just like this whole visibility. Abortion is this sort of 1 or 2 or 3 time incident, and it doesn't show up in people's lives. It doesn't become a part of their identity. Right.
But orientation, as you're saying, they know people who are gay, lesbian, and they're in school, in class with them. Right. And so that normalizing that orientation, and they're not awful people, they're nice, and so I think that contributes a lot to people being able to move a little bit more in a progressive direction around sexual orientation issues than about abortion, for instance.
But I think that if people talked about their abortion experiences, it would make a difference, because then it would be, oh, well, this person that I love or respect, this professor has been part of an abortion experience or whatever, and it would start having that same sort of effect, even though abortion is very different than sexuality, than an actual identity.
So here's a question to both of you. You both work for the CUNY system. You're both educators, you're mentors, you're probably guidance figures for many individuals, many young individual figures. Have you found in your own personal and professional experiences students who maybe come from conservative backgrounds, who have looked to someone like yourself and said, I want to open up, I can't go to my parents? Dr. McGee, Ms. Baumgardner, do you have a few moments? Could I speak with you about something? I don't know where else to turn. And how do you, as an educator, respond to that?
I think when you're, and I feel like we probably have this in common, so I'm just going to assume that. I think when you're a feminist, for lack of a better word, but it's a great word, influenced educator, you absolutely attract those stories, and it's almost like being a pastor or something. You're a repository of these stories, and often all they really want is somebody to listen and to say, that sounds really hard, or I'm sorry. And so I do spend a lot of time doing that, honestly. And people from really conservative backgrounds, people who've been really, really hurt, even in very progressive families, where there was a denial of who they are, or a sense that they couldn't tell the truth about this, or incest. There's so many things that people are dealing with. And so I find that even though especially when I was actually teaching in the classroom, I found it like time-consuming in a way that I was a little worried about, because I was like, I have to write my own things. I can't, I was also really grateful for the reality check and for being entrusted with the stories. And it's a big part of the way that I personally practice my feminism and in my feminist writing is that I signal that I'm someone where I'm safe. You can tell me a story and I won't say, oh, I don't want to hear about that, or that's not for polite company. And I've learned so much about the world because I have signaled that I can hear it.
And I share the same experience. In these papers that my students write, they often will say, I have never told anyone else this. And I'm very moved by that, that I'm entrusted with that story. And, hold it close and talk very often afterward. And I'm just sort of astonished at the breadth of people's experience when they're very young, and some of them have had horrible things happen to them. Kids who've been sexually abused and raped and thrown out of the house because they were gay, or turned to sex work because, and
coerced abortions. I mean, the amount of things, tons of eating disorders, men and regardless of gender, these things are happening too. It's kind of really, it's amazing what we all have our problems, but it's amazing what young people deal with. They always have.
So let's take this one more step. What roles does the internet best serve, and how can we ensure that we mitigate the harm it produces and instead provide a platform for self-discovery? Because for many of these students, they may not approach someone like yourself.
I think it's out of my control for sure, but I do think it's interesting to me how much, I'm alarmed by stuff on the internet and perpetuation of just total myths and things like that. On the other hand, I do think people find ways to connect where there would have just been isolation before. So it's kind of, it's both things. It's scary to me, but also it's changed the world in really positive ways.
I would second that. I think about where I grew up, my little town of 3,000 people with one traffic light. And there are still 3,000 people. There's two traffic lights because there's a Walmart now. But if there was a kid growing up thinking they might be gay or lesbian, there is they might feel like they're the only one and have no other. But with the internet, you can connect with people and find community and sources of helpful information and all the rest of that. And there's also the predatory stuff and the deceitful stuff and the abusive and the exploitative stuff. And, I think we have to really do a lot of media literacy around this for young people to help them to identify who is which organization is a credible source of information, and protect privacy and recognize if you put something online, it is public forever and all that.
I think there's still seemingly a real lack of awareness about that it's permanent. It is a permanent record. And the degree to which because there's going to be so much information out there that record has an ability to really, really hurt you is to be determined, but that there's no way that picture isn't really ever removed in that post. And
so as a parting shot, where do we go from here? As educators, as enlightened individuals, and being representatives of the New York tri-state area, what's next for students in terms of the sexual evolution?
Oh, well, I think we learn from them, and thank God. But I think that the thing that I would like to see that I think has a lot of power is what we've been alluding to, which is the active listening piece. People who can just really listen, not give advice, just listen. If there were more people like that, I think that students, it would be very revolutionary.
And I am likely to repeat this in ensuing episodes, but more and better sexuality education, I think, is really important. At the university level and from, kindergarten on, I really think that our society is so schizoid about sexuality, and there is so much in popular culture that kids don't know how to navigate, and I think there needs to be some safe spaces where a trusted adult who has the comfort and the skill to help them learn how to manage all of that information in ways that are helpful. I think we really need that, and the media literacy. Those two educational components, I think, are really important.
That's great. Michael, Jennifer, thank you so much for the time today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
On that note, we're going to wrap up our show for today. I'd like to thank our guests for their time and their very unique perspectives. If you like what you saw today on today's episode, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. If you'd like to contact myself, you can reach out to me via email or Twitter. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for tuning in. And just remember, Every life is a book. Make yours a bestseller. Have a good night.